All right, today we have with us some of the best students actually in Victoria, wouldn't you say? So, hey Lindsay, what year are you in?
2.
Year 2? What year are you in, Reese? Can you talk?
1.
1, okay. Ewan?
I'm in year 3.
And Soren?
I'm in year 5.
Okay, so we have a bit of a range of different year levels here. Now, and for the students watching here, yeah, there we go. You'll see that we've utilized participants for this video from our own family. So Tim and I don't know if you can notice, but those two kind of what look like clones are Tim's children, 2 of 3, and then these are my 2 boys. So I'm going to start with a few questions. So my first question is, what do you think makes a really good teacher? What kind of things does a good teacher do?
Being kind, but also being strict.
Oh, that's interesting. So what do you mean by that? So can you be both, do you think?
Yeah. Mrs.
Okay.
Bates is kind and strict.
Okay, you can be kind and strict. What do you think, Lauren?
I guess I would like to have like a teacher that's nice and doesn't get mad a lot and doesn't really yell.
Okay. And why? How does that make you feel if the teacher yells at you a lot? Does it make you want to work harder, or does it make you just not want to work at all?
Probably not really want to work at all.
Okay. Ewan, what do you think? What do you think makes a good teacher?
What makes a good teacher is right.
Okay. Well, while he's thinking of it, Reese, what do you think makes a good teacher? Okay, we're gonna have to edit this part because my children don't look very smart. Okay, well, I'm gonna continue the interview with the fish children.
Okay, good teacher is someone. A good teacher is someone. Okay, let me edit this sentence. A good teacher helps you with your learning and actually lets you learn by yourself, not just telling you the answer every single time, then you never learn.
Okay, well, so that brings me to a question that I have for you is sometimes teachers have different approaches. So I want to ask you, does your teacher, when they teach you, do they teach you how to do, so let's say you're learning something new. Do they tell you first what to do and then you do it together and then you do it? Or do they just give you something to do and you have to try to figure it out yourself, maybe in groups?
Sometimes in groups, sometimes alone.
The second one.
Okay.
Normally the teacher would if they're introducing something new, the teacher would normally tell us what it is, how it works, and yeah.
So explain it first.
Yeah, explain it, and then we would either go in pairs by ourselves or in a group, and we'd do like a activity on it.
Okay. One of the things I've noticed now that we have remote learning is that there's a lot more of that kind of teaching so Ewan, can you tell me kind of what your school does at the moment?
My school is doing is they tell us what to do and then we have to do it by ourselves, and then we come back, reflect, and then we move on.
And is that because you don't really get to do stuff as a group anymore?
No, because of coronavirus.
Okay. So which way do you prefer to learn? Do you prefer both, or do you like to have that very specific, you know what you need to do, or do you like to kind of figure it out in groups? What do you think? Reese, what do you think? Which way do you like to learn best?
Like a group.
In a group, okay.
I like it as a mix.
Okay. What do you think, fish boys?
Group, because then we can all help each other.
Yeah. So you think you can learn throughout? Do you think you can learn working with others?
Yeah, because if you have a question, you don't have to put your hand up straight away. You can ask every member in your group, and then if there's another group on your table, ask them, and then ask the teacher.
All right. I think I'm going to end it there. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the teachers that are in this? Okay. All right. We'll end it there. All right, Liam, I have a few questions for you. Can you tell me what year you're in?
10.
Okay. Are you loving it?
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay. So I have a question about kind of teaching. So like for your teachers, think about some of the best teachers that you've had. When they're teaching you something new, how do they go about doing it? So a new concept, a new idea, how do they teach it to you?
They generally put up a PowerPoint and they read through it, and yeah, they go through it with us.
Do you think that's effective? Do you think it works?
Yeah, because then they put it up on the Google Classroom, and then if you get confused, you can just look at the Google Classroom.
Okay, so you think having that and having it be able to go back to for revision or to make sure you understand it?
Yep.
So do they provide like the steps that you need to take to understand it, or how does that work?
Yeah, they do that, and then they provide work that helps us understand it better. So they'll say, no, I was going to say an example, but kind of hard to figure out an example.
And is it the same as what they do if you were actually at school, like on campus? Same sort of approach?
Yeah, they'd put up a PowerPoint on the big screen, and then they'd go through it, explain it, and then they'd give you work to and they go further in depth with your answers and to learn more about it.
The approaches have been a bit similar between home and at school.
Yeah.
So do you do much like collaborative work, like work with other students?
No, not really, not much group work, but they do in remote learning. They made us do because no one talks generally on the Google Meet, and it's probably the same with universities, but
No, they love to talk. They love it. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
and they just stick us in groups of like 2 or 3 with our friends, and then they ask us how we're doing with the work and what we found difficult, and just asking us questions about it.
Okay, so it's more reflective. It's not like you have like a problem or like some kind of task to do together. It's more about just reflection. Would you say that?
Yeah, reflection, yep.
Okay. All right. How do you think you learn best? Do you like it when it's very kind of specific? This is what you need to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, or would you rather have the ability to kind of discover it yourself and then come back and learn about it? Like, what do you think works for you? Or do you think that there's some times when that might work and other times that it wouldn't?
It's interesting enough to go through it. To say you like learning about American Civil War. Let's go there. And then
Thanks.
it'd be nice if they give you like a broad topic to cover. So say, the reasoning for both sides, South and North, and then you have to, I don't know, well, it depends. You can sort of go with it, say different things, economic reasons, political reasons. Yeah.
So you explore it yourself to a certain extent.
It's also good to have the PowerPoint and have set tasks.
So you know exactly what you're doing. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks. And so how does your teacher teach you how to say S and more about the letter and the sound S? What do they do to help you know that?
We sit on the mat, and then she starts doing this.
So
and then
you it.
Copy it.
Okay, so she shows you and then you copy.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you like to learn that way?
Yes.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell me? What things do you like about school or learning?
I like building with the blocks.
So do you get time to just kind of play with the blocks and create your own things?
Yes, and I also like playing a game called Kitties.
Okay. So do you think you get to learn a lot by playing?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so too. We just wanted to talk a little bit. I have my good buddy Tim Fish here, Dr. Tim Fish. And in today's webinar, we would like to talk to you a little bit about, and this is our opportunity to kind of share our experiences with you and try to kind of get our perspectives, whether they're helpful or not, about how we've kind of look at different approaches to pedagogy. So I'll go ahead and start by kind of talking about my education journey. So I obviously, you probably have noticed, I grew up in the States, and I did my initial teacher education program in the States as a primary school teacher, or as we would call them, an elementary school teacher. And when I first finished that degree, I was in a year 3 class, and I had a young girl who didn't speak any English. And I became very, very interested in my first few years of teaching, particularly on English language support and English language development. So I actually later then went back to do my master's and did more on English as an additional language. And that then brought me to travel to many countries and do some international teaching. So in the United Nations International School in Hanoi and in Brunei. So I've had this kind of various experience. And then when I came to Australia, I did some high school teaching. So I've had this kind of array of different kind of education experiences. And then obviously here as a lecturer in a university. So these kind of given me kind of an eclectic view of what I think about what is teaching, what my role is, and so on. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but first I want to give Tim a chance to kind of talk about how he has come to be here at Monash and his kind of education journey.
Yeah, so I came to teaching sort of as a mature age student, so I've worked in the banking industry for a few years and was doing some athletics coaching with a local athletics club, so in a volunteer basis. And that sort of saw me decide to move to the country, and in the same time with a young family take up a teaching degree in Ballarat. So I did a few years there, a little bit around teaching, and then sort of got involved in the PhD. Was very interested in sort of issues of disadvantage, which are quite prominent in Ballarat because it's such, there's a population of sort of around 100,000. So you sort of see, I suppose, sort of disadvantage on a regular basis because, people come into the city of Ballarat. It's not like Melbourne where, especially if you're living in the eastern suburbs, you're sort of, perhaps shielded from people from different backgrounds. So certainly a sort of interest in disadvantage around education piqued my interest into doing a PhD. After that, I did some teaching up in Ballarat for a few years and then moved to Melbourne to take up a job here at Monash, and not just in first year units such as EDF1062, but also teaching in a pathways unit, DOTS out at Peninsula, or it's also called the Diploma of Higher Ed in Clayton. So looking again, I suppose, at alternate pathways to higher education.
That's great. Now, I think it's really interesting, and I know you've done a lot of work in kind of disadvantaged backgrounds and so on. Do you think that kind of approaches to pedagogy change based on, various needs of students? So if they do come from disadvantaged backgrounds, does that change how you teach? Can you maybe talk a little bit about your experiences and how you've approached pedagogy and what you've kind of maybe some of your evolving kind of decisions about what is pedagogy and so on? Can you maybe talk through a little bit about that?
Yep. I think certainly there's a lot of literature and of research around. Sometimes often there's a deficit view of students, especially from low SES backgrounds, so socioeconomic backgrounds. And unfortunately, sort of a lot of teachers, I suppose, you might say, sort of teach down, or see a lot of sort of back to basics type rhetoric, both in media and politicians, especially when you're talking about sort of raising the educational levels and their outcomes for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And often we're sort of looking at a very sort of narrow lens of what students bring and sort of seeing, I suppose often students don't reflect our own backgrounds. We sort of see where they are and what they have in a negative light or a deficit light, rather than sort of looking at some of their own sort of strengths and certainly resilience, etc., and some of the skills and interests that they have that we can sort of bring and draw on in the teaching aid to, I suppose, first off, better engage them, but certainly sort of teaching approaches sort of try and integrate their own interests into the teaching, so they can see connections and they can see meaning, that perhaps, you know, often that can sort of lead to disengagement. So I think they're definitely sort of looking at, you know, the strengths of students, and there's an academic or scholar called Mole who talks about funds of knowledge. So seeing what, you know, students and their communities and their families bring, and sort of drawing on that in the classroom.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I find really interesting, and definitely, you know, the literature talks a lot about this, is that student and teacher relationship. And I think one of the reasons, and probably very similar to you, Tim, one of the reasons why I came into education was because actually, you know, I actually remember being in high school or secondary school, and, you know, you had to take this, like, you know, what you're going to be when you grow up. And it was, for me, it was kind of like, it's either going to be a teacher or a nurse. And given that, like I cut my finger, you know, on a piece of paper, and I start kind of getting a little bit sick. I knew that was probably out of the question. But one of the things that has drawn me to education is that I actually enjoy people. That's one thing. I actually do, like, even this lockdown, it's really a struggle for me because I'm fueled by relationships. And one of the great things about even, you know, teaching at university is I really enjoy my students, and I really enjoy those relationships. And also when I was teaching in primary or secondary, I get a lot out of those relationships, and I get a lot of, you know, from the idea of, can I actually support them? Can I do something to support their learning? And really, actually, my kind of journey was something where I thought I would be going more kind of the development route. So I thought I was going to be teaching in South America, and so I thought I would be, you know, teaching in those kind of areas. But it really, what drew me to this kind of profession is that opportunity to provide those really strong relationships, particularly because young people are so vulnerable. And I think that to be a person and have some kind of opportunity to be part of someone's life and to inspire them and to do anything, and actually just to give them the skills that they need, I think is quite, I think that's a rewarding part of education. So that's what brought me to this. So that student-teacher relationship is really important to me. We talk about, like, pedagogical kind of approaches, and I think that approach of care has always been something, and I can sense, Tim, that would be very much you too, that idea of caring and actually being that kind of, obviously teaching things, but also that kind of pedagogy of care is probably reflects in my own teaching philosophy. One of the things as a language teacher I found really interesting, because I think when I was teaching in Vietnam in particular, I was at a IB school, an international baccalaureate school. So I taught in the PYP program, so that's the primary years program. So it's an inquiry-based program. And one of the interesting things, and this is where we talk about pedagogies and various pedagogies, and, you know, kind of our children, you know, have talked about these kind of ideas of, you know, different ways. But I think as educators, it's kind of like we have to have an arsenal. That sounds really horrible. An arsenal of an arsenal of kind of things that we can pull out at any time, so that any situation, there's various approaches depending on the context, depending on the child, depending on the subject, and knowing that there's not just one thing that defines us, but that we understand the situation, we identify the issues within the situation, and we choose the appropriate approach. And I think that particularly in language, it's been really interesting because, well, I think probably I guess I'm drawn to the idea of inquiry-based approaches.
Mm-hmm.
Language tends to have a very explicit approach. And I know this because I was part of that generation where grammar wasn't explicitly taught. We've kind of gone, like the education system does this, where grammar was explicitly taught to, okay, we discover grammar through, you know, learning the language. And it wasn't until I actually started becoming a language teacher that I actually identified the very structures that helped me learn the language. And I find this really interesting even for students, because a lot of our international students, like, they actually understand the language probably much better than, you know, from students who speak, you know, English as their first or home language. So for me as a teacher, I've always had to kind of embrace that idea of explicit instruction. So being able to really unpack in manageable chunks kind of instruction, to be able to very clear and very precise. And you'll see this in how this unit runs, is we have various steps that we try to present. But I'm also really passionate about that idea that I want my students to question and to explore things based on, and make it meaningful to them. So, to engage with questions and problems and people and thoughts that actually make it meaningful for them. So I find that I don't think that I'm one camp of a pedagogical approach, but I feel like I have to actually embrace all of them depending on the situation. What do you think, Tim, since I've just been rattling on for a while?
And definitely even in inquiry learning, there's times where you have to be sort of use that sort of direct instruction to, as you said, describe a new concept or skill or whatever it happens to be, in order to enable the students to explore these things for themselves, or they need the sort of tools to be able to do that. So hence, direct instruction definitely has a place in that. And that's not sort of to, I suppose, confuse that with sort of transmissive teaching, where it's sort of just, teacher-led, sort of almost lecture-based. And as you said, it's sort of usually, in manageable chunks, and it's related to, whether it be the unit of work or whatever if we're talking about inquiry, about the topic at the time. So it definitely does have a relevance. It's not sort of something just sort of abstract that's sort of brought in that sort of seems to have no relevance to anything else. So, and I think that sort of contextualization of that is really important as well. So students, I remember, when I was in high school, and probably you all remember when you were in high school, and especially, we'll pick on poor maths, you're doing some, sine, cos, tan, trigonometry thing, and why would you need to learn this? What do we ever use it for? And I think, teachers who can sort of demonstrate, what this is used for, why it's important, even though you might not be wanting to be an engineer or whatever, you can see the sort of the uses for things. I think it sort of helps, the buy-in of students to, see a relevance to it. And even if it doesn't have to necessarily, be relevant directly to them, that they can see the sort of relevance in their learning. And as you said, being well scaffolded. So through that sort of, breaking things down. And again, I think sort of contextualized. And I certainly think, yes, the boys sort of talked about, talking or working in groups, and as opposed to sort of working by themselves. And Ewan, I think, spoke about sort of having a mix. So sometimes he liked to work by himself and sometimes with a group. Or my two boys were sort of more, sort of help each other. And also I think the different ages reflect that a bit too. There's sort of, obviously, for my oldest, or my son Soren, who was in grade 5, there's a lot more independent working, and whether that's sort of established groups or they're just working on a table, that there's opportunities there that they can sort of seek help from their peers, rather than sort of always needing guidance from the teacher. So yeah.
And I think that's like a practicality thing. Like, I think what I've noticed that's been really interesting with the remote learning, and I kind of mentioned that discussing with the boys, is that the boys' school has this kind of, they've organized it so that, like, for maths and reading and writing, they'll have what they call a launch. And so all of the kids in the class are on at the same time. And then, it's basically that explicit instruction. And then they go into kind of like focus groups or independent. So they kind of switch in and out of that. And then they have a reflection. And I remember asking the boys about that, and they said, well, it's because we can't actually work together. So they would probably have had that kind of time in between where they were probably doing more group work. But in a lot of ways, I feel like remote learning has kind of brought to the front this explicit teaching. And I think it is starting to really work, and not for all students, but really being very clear of what needs to be, what they're learning. And again, that goes back to planning and, what do we want the students to actually get out of this particular day, out of this lesson, out of what it is. So, but, I also kind of think about, I remember when I first came to the area where I live, and the boys actually go to, it's a, local school, government school, and it is a PYP school. So, that was good for me because I have experience in that. But I remember talking with parents, and they said, oh, well, inquiry learning, it's kind of like free-based, they just do a project and then they can do whatever they want. And I found it really interesting because my experience with PYP was, as a teacher, what we would usually do is, it's all about questioning. But what we would do is we would have, like, usually when I was teaching year 5, we'd have all the year, we had, there were 4 of us, and there were 4 year 5 teachers, and we'd actually bring all of the year 5 students together. And like, let's say we had a topic, and I remember one year it was work. Okay, so like really broad. And so we kind of had this discussion about like what that means and so on. And then we started just getting them to ask questions, and we were putting them on the board, and then we were categorizing them. And then we were trying to kind of identify projects that they could do. So there was a lot of like specific, explicit kind of discussion and teaching in line with this inquiry. So they were kind of pushing the, you know, what, and this was year 5 too, but they knew what they wanted to look into and investigate, but at the same time, we were very much part of what was being, you know, we were linking it to the curriculum. We were making sure that we had some key things. We had science, we had all these different aspects that were connected to it. And I think that's the thing is, I don't think that they can necessarily exist without each other. I think you have to have a combination of both.
Yeah, and I think definitely there's, yeah, the teacher, I suppose you might say, sort of steering it in certain directions, or, you know, there's some things that they need to have students, you know, cover in terms of content, skills.
We've just lost Mr. Tim Fish. Oh, he's back. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What was I saying? Yeah. So certainly there's content skills, etc., that they need to learn, and so that sort of, I suppose, sort of plan throughout the inquiry process, and so that, I suppose, provides some scope, because that's not all. And as you said, sort of even in the initial discussion, there's sort of prompts. Otherwise, you know, a room full of students, and, you know, like for those kids, you know, you ask them a question, it's like, what? So there needs to be some sort of scaffolding and some scoping and some sort of guiding, leading questions, if you like, to try and sort of have them thinking more specifically, because that just sort of asks a random question, you're not going to sort of get much out. So even in that regard, there is sort of planning around, you know, I suppose even that sort of introductory part of an inquiry unit, you know, even that sort of tuning in phase in the inquiry process. Yeah, it might be playing a video or just sort of orienting students to thinking about a particular topic. So even in that, there's I suppose, as I said, a scope that what you're looking at, rather than sort of coming with this sort of very, very broad topic, like you said, like work. I'm sure within that, there's sort of different aspects that you're looking at them to think about, even with those questions that you're talking about. So while it might seem sort of very, I suppose, sort of random or free for all, there's, as you said, there's sort of guiding questions, there's leading questions to help sort of drive and ascertain from students, you know, their interests, their knowledge, and getting a sense of their sort of what they know about, you know, the topic, what they need to know. So it's not just sort of just random, have a think about topic X. That's very much sort of guided. So I think that's the important thing to think about, you know, whether it's inquiry-based learning or something a bit more explicit.
I think there's, you know, 2 more kind of things, I think, you know, just an interesting thing to kind of pose or to think of. I think one of the questions, you know, that I consider is who owns the learning? Like we often say like student learning, but as teachers, we do control a lot of it. So it's having this kind of balance of going, yes, I need to explicitly teach this so it's very clear and so that I can actually help my students learn this. But at the same time, there needs to be some ownership for them to make it meaningful. And so, and allowing them to own the process of learning as well. So having that balance, I think, is really important. And then I think the second thing is just knowing your students, because, you know, as we both know, I think that you know, as our children, you know, I see my 2 so very, very different in the way that they approach learning. And if that's just in my home, you can imagine one classroom that has so many different personalities. And so I think it's really important to actually know your students so that you can identify, you know, not only use a range of different approaches, but to really be able to utilize and know how students are going to react to that and where you need to provide that additional support and guidance and scaffolding to actually make sure that everyone is maximizing their learning opportunities.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been fun. It's kind of like, you know, coffee time. We just need, you know, some stools and a nice, you know, bit of coffee to kind of, but thanks for joining us here on our little chat about different pedagogical approaches. We hope that it's been entertaining because, you know, It's our children. And as you can see, we've been in lockdown for a while. So it's
Lockdown is still crazy, honest.
Anyway, thanks for tuning in.